3 weddings performed in secret. 3 women who believed they were his only love. 16 children born into a web of lies so intricate, so impossibly brazen, that when the truth finally emerged, it shattered the most sacred brotherhood in all of Westeros. This is the story of Ser Lucamore Strong, a knight of the Kingsguard who wore the white cloak of honor while living the darkest deception in the history of the 7 kingdoms. A man who swore the most sacred vows before king and gods, vows of eternal celibacy, of lifelong service, of absolute purity, and then he broke every single one of them. For years, he walked between 3 different lives, 3 separate households, 3 wives who never knew about each other, 16 innocent children scattered across the realm, all calling the same man father, a man who should have fathered none. The logistics alone seem impossible. The audacity, breathtaking. The consequences when they finally came were brutal beyond imagination. But here's what haunts me most about this tale. How did he manage it? How does a member of the most watched, most scrutinized order of knights in the entire kingdom hide 3 entire families? What drove him to risk everything, not once, but again and again? And when the walls finally closed in, when his white cloak was torn from his shoulders and he stood before the Iron Throne in chains, what thoughts raced through his mind as King Jaehaerys pronounced a sentence so severe, so permanently devastating, that it would echo through history for centuries? Tonight we're going to unravel every thread of this extraordinary scandal, from his rise to glory, to his years of deception, to the moment everything came crashing down, to the price he paid in blood, flesh, and freedom. But before we begin, I need to mention something. About 84% of you watching right now haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these deep dives into the hidden histories of Westeros, if you want more stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel grow and lets me keep bringing you these tales. And I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It connects us all through these stories. Now, get comfortable. Dim those lights. Settle into your blanket. Let the world outside fade away, and let's step back in time to an era of dragons and kings, of honor and betrayal, of white cloaks and broken vows. This is the complete story of Lucamore the Lusty. Our story unfolds during the golden age of House Targaryen, in the long and prosperous reign of King Jaehaerys I, called the Conciliator, called the Old King. This was approximately 54 to 72 years after Aegon's conquest, a time when dragons still filled the skies above Westeros, when the Iron Throne's power was absolute and unquestioned, when the realm knew peace under the wisest king it would ever see. King Jaehaerys ruled from the Red Keep in King's Landing, that massive fortress of red stone that towers over Blackwater Bay. Beside him sat his beloved queen, Alysanne, the Good Queen, adored by small folk and nobles alike. Together they brought prosperity, justice, and stability to the 7 kingdoms. It was an age of building, of lawmaking, of consolidation. The realm flourished. And protecting this king, standing eternal watch over the Iron Throne, were the 7 knights of the Kingsguard. The Kingsguard. Even the name carries weight. These were not merely skilled warriors. Though they were the finest swords in the realm, they were living symbols of the ultimate sacrifice. Each man chosen for the white cloak underwent a transformation that severed him from his former life completely. He renounced all claim to lands, to titles, to his family name. He swore to hold no property, to father no children, to take no wife. His entire existence, from the moment that white cloak settled on his shoulders until his dying breath, belonged to one purpose alone: protecting the king. In the White Sword Tower, connected to the Red Keep by a covered bridge, these 7 knights lived apart from the world. Their chambers were sparse, almost monastic. Their days were filled with duty, training, vigilance, while other men pursued glory, wealth, love, family. The King's Guard pursued only honor. Theirs was a lonely path, but a glorious one. Their names would live forever in the White Book, the chronicle of every knight who ever wore the cloak. Among these legendary warriors, in the later years of Jaehaerys's reign, served a knight from House Strong of Harrenhal, Sir Lucamore Strong, tall and powerfully built as his house name suggested, handsome in the way that turned heads at court, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile and natural charm that made him beloved by common folk and nobles alike. He was skilled with sword and lance, a tournament champion, a warrior who had earned his white cloak through genuine prowess and courage. But there was something else about Lucamore Strong, something that set him apart from his brother knights in ways that had nothing to do with martial skill. He loved women. Not in the courtly, chivalrous way that knights were supposed to admire fair ladies from respectful distance. No, Lucamore had an appetite, a hunger that his vows of celibacy could never satisfy. Even before the scandal broke, the whispers had already begun. Fellow knights, servants, courtiers, they had already given him a nickname. They called him Lucamore, the Lusty. They had no idea how fitting that name would prove to be. Lucamore Strong came from Harrenhal, that cursed fortress in the Riverlands where the stones still bear the scorch marks of dragon fire from Aegon's conquest. House Strong held those blackened towers, trying to make something proud from ruins that had destroyed so many families before them. Growing up in the shadow of those melted stone walls, Lucamore learned early what it meant to carry a name heavy with expectation. Strong by name, strong by nature. That's what his father told him. Every House Strong son had to prove the words meant something. He trained in the yards of Harrenhal from the time he could lift a practice sword. The masters at arms recognized his natural talent immediately. He wasn't just skilled, he was gifted. His sword work flowed like water, precise and devastating. His strength made other boys stumble backward when blades met. By 15 he was defeating knights twice his age in the training yard. By 18 he was winning tournaments. The tourneys brought him fame. At Maidenpool he unhorsed 3 knights in succession. At Duskendale he won the melee against 40 competitors. Lords and ladies began to know his name, began to watch for the black bat of House Strong on the tournament fields, and Lucamore loved it. The attention, the admiration, the way noble women would offer him their favors before a joust. He wore their ribbons and smiled, that easy smile that made hearts flutter throughout the stands. But he wanted more than tournament glory. He wanted his name written in history. When King Jaehaerys announced that a position in the King's Guard had opened, every ambitious knight in the realm began maneuvering for consideration. The competition was fierce. Only the finest warriors, men of proven courage and skill, could even hope to be considered. Lords wrote letters of recommendation. Knights performed increasingly dangerous deeds trying to catch the king's attention. Lucamore's chance came during a royal progress through the Riverlands. The king and queen were traveling with only a small escort when bandits attacked on the road near Harrenhal. Common thieves, emboldened by numbers, thinking they could overwhelm the guards and claim a ransom that would set them up for life. They hadn't counted on Lucamore Strong happening to be riding that same road. He heard the sounds of combat and spurred his horse toward the fight without hesitation. What he did in the next few minutes became the stuff of legend. 6 bandits fell to his sword. His horse trampled 2 more. By the time the king's own guards had rallied, Lucamore had already turned the tide of the ambush. He took a wound to his shoulder in the process, but he never stopped fighting until every threat was eliminated. King Jaehaerys himself helped bandage that wound. The king looked into Lucamore's eyes and saw exactly what he wanted in a King's Guard knight. Courage, skill, instant loyalty, willingness to put his body between danger and the crown. Within a month, the summons came. Lucamore Strong was invited to King's Landing to join the most elite brotherhood in the Seven Kingdoms. His family celebrated like he had won a crown. House Strong's prestige would rise dramatically. Having a son in the Kingsguard meant royal favor, meant their name spoken in the same breath as the greatest houses in the realm. His father wept with pride. His mother held him close, knowing she would rarely see him again, but understanding the honor was worth the sacrifice. The ceremony took place in the throne room before the entire court. Lucamore walked up that long aisle toward the Iron Throne, his boots echoing on stone. Hundreds of eyes watching. King Jaehaerys sat above, regal and wise, with Queen Alysanne beside him radiating grace. The 6 other Kingsguard knights stood at attention, white cloaks brilliant against their armor. Lord Commander Ser Ryam Redwyn, the finest knight in the realm, administered the vows. His voice rang out clear and stern, each word weighted with centuries of tradition. Lucamore knelt, the cold stone pressed against his knee, his heart hammered in his chest. "Do you swear to guard the king with your life?" "I swear it." "Do you swear to obey his commands?" "I swear it." "Do you swear to keep his secrets?" "I swear it." "Do you swear to defend his name and honor?" "I swear it." Then came the vow that would define everything that followed. Sir Ryam's eyes bore into him. "Do you swear to take no wife, to hold no lands, to father no children, to serve faithfully until death?" Lucamore felt the weight of those words. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice questioned whether he truly understood what he was promising. But the moment was too grand, the honor too great, the pride too overwhelming. His voice rang out strong and clear. "I swear it." The white cloak settled onto his shoulders. It felt heavier than he expected, beautiful and pure, unmarked by any stain. He was no longer just Lucamore Strong. He was Sir Lucamore Strong of the Kingsguard. His former life ended in that moment. A new existence began. For the first few years, he kept those vows perfectly. He stood guard for hours without complaint. He trained relentlessly. He attended the king at councils and ceremonies. He slept in his sparse chamber in the White Sword Tower and found satisfaction in duty well performed. His brothers in white accepted him, respected him, trusted him. But as time passed, something began to gnaw at him. The loneliness of it, the emptiness. He would stand guard outside chambers where the king and queen shared their private moments, hearing their soft laughter, their intimate conversations. He would walk through courtyards where fathers played with children, where husbands kissed wives, where life continued in all its messy, beautiful complexity. And he had none of it, could have none of it, ever. The white cloak felt heavier with each passing month, not with honor anymore, but with absence, with everything he had given up, with everything he could never have. That's when the dangerous thoughts began. Her name might have been Elise, though history never recorded it with certainty. She worked in a tavern near the Street of Silk, serving wine to merchants and minor nobles who came to King's Landing seeking fortune. Lucamore met her during one of his rare evenings off-duty when he ventured out to hear the minstrels play. She had dark hair that caught the candlelight, and when she laughed at something a customer said, Lucamore found he couldn't look away. He told himself he was just appreciating beauty the way any man might. Nothing wrong with looking. The vows said nothing about looking. But then he spoke to her, and she spoke back, and her voice had a warmth that made something in his chest ache. He returned to that tavern the next week, and the week after, they began talking, carefully at first, then, with increasing ease. She made him feel like a man again, instead of just a symbol in white. When she touched his hand while passing him a cup of wine, he felt electricity run through his entire body. Did he tell her he was Kingsguard? The histories aren't clear. Perhaps he lied, claimed to be a knight in service to some lord, traveling frequently for his duties. Perhaps she knew and didn't care. Or perhaps she never suspected that this charming, attentive man who made her feel special was bound by vows that should have made their relationship impossible. Within 6 months he was in love, or thought he was, or convinced himself he was, because it justified what came next. They married in secret. Lucamore found a septon in Flea Bottom, one who asked few questions when gold changed hands. The ceremony happened at midnight, in a crumbling sept that smelled of mildew and old incense. No family attended, no celebration followed, just 2 people speaking vows that one of them had no right to speak. When Lucamore placed that ring on her finger, when he kissed her as a husband kisses his wife, he felt triumph mixed with terror. He had done it. He had claimed something for himself that the Kingsguard vows demanded he renounce, and the world hadn't ended. Lightning hadn't struck him down. The white cloak in his chambers didn't suddenly turn black with sin. He rented her a small house in a quiet part of the city. Nothing grand but comfortable. He visited whenever duty allowed, sometimes sneaking away for a few hours, sometimes managing an entire night. When she told him she was pregnant, panic and joy warred inside him. A child, his child, something he had sworn before gods and king he would never have. But when he held that baby, when tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, the guilt dissolved into pure love. Then came another child, then a third. Suddenly he was a father, and fatherhood felt more real, more important than anything his white cloak represented. The lies became second nature, covering his absences, explaining away his time, maintaining 2 completely separate existences. He grew skilled at compartmentalizing. When he stood in the throne room, he was pure Kingsguard. When he walked through that small house's door, he was husband and father. 2 men living in one body, neither acknowledging the other existed. 4 years passed. He should have been satisfied. He had more than most men who took the white cloak, more than he deserved. But human nature works in strange ways. The thrill of getting away with the impossible becomes addictive. And Lucamore began to think, if he could hide one family, why not more? He met the second woman in Duskendale during a trip accompanying the king on royal business. She sold flowers in the market, and her smile rivaled the blooms she offered. He was supposed to be standing guard. Instead, he found himself talking to her, buying bouquets he had no use for just to make the conversation last longer. This time, the descent happened faster. He already knew how to maintain a secret life. He already had the infrastructure of lies in place. He told his first wife his duties required even more frequent travel. He told his second wife the same story he'd told the first. Whatever that story had been, a different septon performed another midnight wedding. The second household he established further from King's Landing, in a village outside Duskendale, where he could visit less frequently but still maintain the relationship. More children came. His careful budgeting became desperate juggling. The Kingsguard's stipend that had seemed generous now stretched impossibly thin across 2 families. But he managed. Somehow, impossibly, he managed. Rotating his visits, keeping his stories straight, never mixing details between households. His first wife thought his long absences were because of increased duties at court. His second wife accepted his explanations about serving a demanding lord. Neither knew the other existed. 6 years into this double deception, something broke inside him. Or maybe it was arrogance that had been building all along. He had done the impossible twice. The white cloak still sat on his shoulders. His brothers still trusted him. King Jaehaerys still relied on him. He was invincible, untouchable, too clever to ever be caught. The third woman he encountered at an inn in the Riverlands, not far from Harrenhal actually. coming full circle to near where his story began. She was a widow, which perhaps made the courtship easier. She understood loneliness. When Lucamore offered her security, companionship, love, she accepted without extensive questions about his circumstances. By this point, the weddings barely registered as significant in his mind. Just another ceremony, another septon paid for silence, another set of vows that conflicted with vows he'd already shattered beyond repair. What difference did it make now? He was already damned. If the gods cared about such things, might as well be damned for 3 families as for 2. This third household he placed in a small town in the Riverlands, where his periodic visits could be explained as trips to maintain connections with House Strong. More children arrived. The count grew staggering. 16 children total across 3 families, scattered across multiple locations, all with strong blood running through their veins, none with any legal right to claim that name. 16 lives he was responsible for. 16 futures dependent on his ability to maintain the most elaborate deception ever attempted by a Kingsguard knight. The mathematics alone were dizzying. 3 wives expecting attention, affection, financial support. 16 children needing food, clothes, shoes, education. 3 households requiring rent, furnishing, maintenance. His mind became a ledger of lies. Which wife thought he was where on which day? Which children had birthdays coming up? Which household needed what supplies? The mental gymnastics required just to keep the story straight would have exhausted most men. Lucamore thrived on it. Or at least he seemed to. Outwardly he remained the charming, capable knight his brothers knew. Never missed a duty, never failed in his responsibilities. His swordsmanship stayed sharp. His vigilance protecting the king never wavered. If anything, he seemed happier than the other Kingsguard knights, more content with the isolation of their existence. No one suspected he had created 3 entirely separate worlds beyond the White Sword Tower's walls. 3 women who loved him, who built their lives around his irregular visits, who believed his promises about eventually finding more time together. 16 children who called him father during his brief appearances, who wondered why he couldn't stay longer, who accepted his explanations about important work that called him away. The web of deception had grown so complex, so intricate, that it seemed like a living thing with its own existence. And Lucamore sat at the center of it, spinning new threads constantly, convinced the web would never break. He had forgotten that even the strongest spider's web is still just silk and air, fragile, temporary, waiting for the right wind to tear it apart. The logistics of maintaining 3 families while serving in the Kingsguard required planning that would have impressed military strategists. Lucamore's life became a carefully choreographed dance, where one misstep meant total catastrophe. His days followed rigid patterns: morning guard duty at the Red Keep, standing watch outside the small council chamber, or the royal apartments. Afternoons training in the yard with his brother knights, maintaining the combat skills that had earned him the white cloak in the first place. Evenings might bring formal dinners, ceremonies, or additional guard rotations depending on the king's schedule. But between these duties existed gaps, hours here and there, a full day off each week, longer periods when the king didn't require his immediate presence. Most Kingsguard knights used this time for prayer, study, rest, or simple contemplation in the White Sword Tower. Lucamore used every spare moment to be someone else entirely. His first wife lived closest, just within King's Landing's sprawling boundaries. He could slip away for a few hours, play the role of husband and father, then return before anyone noticed his absence. Those visits became his routine escapes, a brief touch of normal life before donning the white cloak again. The second family in Duskendale required more elaborate arrangements. He would request leave to attend a tournament, or visit his family's holdings at Harrenhal. Lord Commander Serayam Redwine rarely denied such requests. Why would he? Lucamore had proven himself trustworthy for years. Instead of going to Harrenhal, though, Lucamore would ride to Duskendale, spend precious days with his second wife and their children, then return to King's Landing with stories about his elderly mother's health or repairs needed at the family keep. The third family, furthest away in the Riverlands, demanded the most creative excuses. Extended trips ostensibly to represent the king at regional ceremonies, escorts for minor nobles traveling dangerous roads, investigations into rumors that required a Kingsguard's authority. Each absence had to be justified, documented, remembered so the story stayed consistent. The financial mathematics were even more challenging than the scheduling. A Kingsguard knight received a generous stipend by most standards, but it was meant to support one man with simple needs. Lucamore was supporting 3 complete households plus 16 growing children. He became creative out of necessity. Tournament winnings helped when he could participate. Gifts from grateful nobles whose daughters he had honored at feasts provided occasional windfalls. Perhaps he even accepted bribes, though the histories don't record such details. Money that should have lasted a month disappeared in weeks. He was always calculating, always worrying, always one financial emergency away from exposure. Each household required different explanations for his frequent absences. His first wife believed his Kingsguard duties demanded irregular hours and occasional overnight posts. She accepted this because she knew he served the king, though she likely didn't fully understand the extent of his obligations. His second and third wives thought him a knight in service to a traveling lord, constantly on the move for his master's business. They never questioned why he couldn't stay longer, because they never imagined he had anywhere else to be. The children complicated everything in ways Lucamore hadn't anticipated. Young children accept their father's comings and goings without deep analysis. But as they grew older, they asked harder questions. Why can't you stay? When will you come back? Why don't we visit you where you work? Each question required a carefully constructed answer that satisfied without revealing anything. Meanwhile, back at the Red Keep, Lucamore performed his Kingsguard duties with seemingly effortless competence. He stood guard beside King Jaehaerys during important councils, hearing matters of state that shaped the realm. He protected Queen Alysanne during her charitable visits to the city, his white cloak a symbol of the crown's protection. He trained younger knights in the arts of combat, sharing techniques he had perfected over years of practice. His relationship with his brother knights seemed genuine and warm. He shared meals with them in the White Sword Tower, exchanging stories and jokes like any close-knit military unit. He participated in their discussions about duty, honor, and the weight of the vows they had all taken. No one looking at him would have suspected the truth. He was simply Lucamore the Lusty, cheerful and charming, perhaps a bit too interested in pretty faces at court, but fundamentally solid. Lord Commander Seer Ryam Redwyn valued him as a reliable member of the Guard. Ryam himself was the very embodiment of Kingsguard virtue, a man who took his vows with absolute seriousness and expected the same from his brothers. If Ryam had suspected for even a moment what Lucamore was doing, the revelation would have crushed him. Instead, he trusted Lucamore completely, granted him leave when requested, and relied on him for important assignments. The psychological toll of this constant deception manifested in subtle ways. Lucamore developed an almost supernatural ability to compartmentalize his life into separate mental boxes that never touched each other. When he stood in the throne room, the houses with wives and children simply didn't exist in his consciousness. When he played with his kids, the Kingsguard ceased to matter. This dissociation wasn't madness exactly, but a coping mechanism for maintaining contradictory identities. Yet the strain showed sometimes if you knew where to look. He slept less than the other nights, his mind always racing through schedules and stories. He startled easily when surprised, the constant low-level paranoia making him jumpy. Small details would trip him up occasionally. mixing up names or dates, though he covered these slips so smoothly that no one caught the errors. The thrill of getting away with it became addictive in its own right. Each successful deception fed his confidence. Each close call that he navigated reinforced his belief in his own cleverness. He began to feel invincible, as though the rules that governed other men simply didn't apply to him. This arrogance would eventually prove his undoing, but for years it served as fuel that kept the impossible machine running. There were moments of genuine happiness scattered throughout the chaos. Holding a newborn child who had his eyes, watching his older children learn to walk, to read, to fight with wooden swords, lying beside a wife who loved him without knowing the truth. These moments felt stolen, illicit, infinitely precious because they shouldn't exist at all. But there were darker moments too. Nights when guilt gnawed at him, when he lay awake in his sparse chamber at Whitesword Tower and wondered what he had become. A man built entirely of lies. A father who could never truly be present. A husband multiplied by 3, which meant he was never a real husband to anyone. A knight whose shining white cloak concealed the blackest deception. He would push these thoughts away come morning. There was no turning back now. The web was too intricate to unravel voluntarily. Either he maintained it until death, or it would collapse and destroy everything. Those were the only 2 possibilities his mind allowed him to consider. He never imagined there was a third option, that someone might simply notice what should have been obvious all along. Nobody knows exactly what triggered the unraveling. The histories from that era offer conflicting accounts, each chronicler adding their own embellishments to an already scandalous tale. What we do know is that sometime around 72 AC, whispers began circulating through King's Landing about Sir Lucamore Strong and a woman who definitely was not his sister. Perhaps it started with something as simple as a servant noticing patterns. Servants see everything in a castle, and they talk. A chambermaid might have observed that Lucamore's chambers were rarely used on certain nights. A stable boy could have tracked which direction he rode when he claimed to be visiting Harrenhal, but never took the King's Road north. These small observations pile up like snow on a roof, harmless individually, catastrophic collectively. Or maybe one of the children gave it away. 16 children are hard to hide, and as they grew older, they moved through the world beyond their mothers' houses. A boy bearing a striking resemblance to a Kingsguard knight, perhaps playing in the streets near the Red Keep. Someone who knew Lucamore's face, seeing those same features on a child who shouldn't exist. Children are innocent, unaware of the secrets they carry in their very appearance. The financial trail might have exposed him. 3 households require constant funding, and money leaves traces. A servant of the royal household responsible for managing Kingsguard stipends might have noticed irregular patterns. Why would a knight with no family, no lands, no legitimate expenses need to withdraw his entire pay plus tournament winnings, plus gifts from nobles? Where was all that gold going? Whatever the initial spark, once suspicion formed, it spread like fire through dry tinder. People began paying attention to Lucamore's movements in ways they never had before. The benefit of doubt that had protected him for years evaporated. Actions that once seemed normal now appeared suspicious. Someone began following him. We don't know who took on this investigative role initially. Perhaps another Kingsguard brother, troubled by inconsistencies in Lucamore's stories. Perhaps a member of the City Watch, acting on rumors. Perhaps even an agent of the Crown, though that seems less likely given King Jaehaerys's surprise when the truth emerged. The first family was discovered within weeks of serious investigation. A house in King's Landing where Sir Lucamore Strong of the Kingsguard visited regularly, staying overnight, embracing a woman and children as a husband and father would. The evidence was undeniable. Witnesses confirmed multiple sightings over years. For most men, this revelation alone would have been catastrophic. For a Kingsguard knight, it meant the complete destruction of honor and career. The investigator probably felt satisfied, assuming they had uncovered the full extent of Lucamore's betrayal. But something didn't add up. The numbers were wrong. Lucamore's financial expenditures exceeded what one secret family would require. His absences followed patterns that suggested multiple destinations, not just one. A thorough investigator would have pressed further. The discovery of the second family must have been shocking even to those already convinced of Lucamore's guilt. One secret wife might be explained as a terrible lapse of judgment, a moment of weakness extended too long. Two secret wives suggested something far darker: systematic deception, calculated betrayal, not a man who broke under the weight of his vows, but a man who mocked them deliberately. When the third family came to light, the scandal transcended anything the Kingsguard had ever experienced. 3 wives, 3 separate households, children in double digits. This wasn't a knight who fell from grace. This was a man who never intended to keep his vows in the first place. The investigation compiled meticulous records, testimonies from neighbors who had seen Lucamore coming and going, statements from the wives themselves, who by this point had learned of each other's existence and were dealing with their own catastrophic revelations, financial documents showing the flow of gold from royal coffers to 3 separate households, birth records for 16 children, all within the time frame of Lucamore's service in the Kingsguard. Lord Commander Sir Riam Redwine received the report first. Imagine that moment. A man who embodied everything the Kingsguard represented, who had served with absolute dedication for decades, being handed proof that one of his trusted brothers had made a mockery of their sacred brotherhood. The histories say Riam wept when he read the evidence, whether from rage, sorrow, or shame that he had missed the signs, we cannot know. Riam confronted Lucamore privately, giving him one chance to explain before taking the matter to the king. Perhaps Riam hoped for some impossible justification, some context that would make sense of the senseless. Instead, Lucamore broke down completely. The years of maintaining perfect composure shattered in moments. He confessed everything. Every lie, every secret meeting, every child. The words poured out like poison being drawn from a wound. There was no defiance in that moment, no attempt to justify his actions. Lucamore knew he was caught. The elaborate structure he had built over nearly 2 decades collapsed around him, and he stood in the ruins admitting what he had done. 3 wives, 16 children, years of deception. He said it all. The white cloak was torn from his shoulders immediately. Riam could not bear to see it on him. Another moment. Lucamore Strong was no longer a knight of the Kingsguard. He was just a man who had betrayed every oath he had ever sworn. Word spread through the Red Keep faster than plague. Servants whispered to nobles. Nobles whispered to each other. By evening, all of King's Landing knew. The Kingsguard knight with 3 wives and 16 children. The scandal was too enormous, too bizarre to contain. People gathered in taverns and marketplaces, sharing the story with embellishments and shocked laughter. The 3 wives learned about each other in the cruelest possible way. Imagine believing yourself married, building your entire life around a man, raising his children, only to discover you were one of 3 women receiving the same promises. The betrayal cut deeper than any sword. Each woman had trusted him completely. Each had organized her world around his irregular visits and reassuring words. Now they learned it was all performance, all calculation. The children suffered differently, but no less deeply. Old enough to understand what their father's actions meant, young enough to be devastated by the loss of the only parent who mattered in their world. Their mothers might have told them their father was special, important, serving something greater. Now they learned he was a liar and an oath-breaker, and by extension, they were living proof of his sins. King Jaehaerys received the news with cold fury. This was a man who valued law, order, and the sanctity of oaths above almost everything. His reign had brought stability to the realm precisely because he insisted on consequences for actions. Lucamore's betrayal wasn't just personal dishonor, it was an attack on the institution of the King's Guard itself, on the principle that men of quality could be trusted to keep their word. Queen Alisanne's reaction was more complex. She felt sympathy for the wives and children, innocents caught in Lucamore's web of lies, but she also understood that justice required punishment. The question wasn't whether Lucamore deserved consequences. The question was what those consequences should be, and how to balance punishment with mercy for those he had harmed. Lucamore was imprisoned in the dungeons beneath the Red Keep, stripped of his white cloak, his armor, his dignity. He sat in darkness knowing what was coming: a trial, judgment, punishment severe enough to deter any future Kingsguard from similar betrayal. His life as he knew it was over. What remained was simply waiting to learn how much worse it would get. The fall from Kingsguard knight to prisoner happened in less than a day. Years of careful deception unraveled in hours. The man who thought himself too clever to ever be caught now faced the reality that everyone gets caught eventually. The only variables are when and how severely they pay for what they have done. For Lucamore Strong, both answers were about to become terrifyingly clear. The throne room of the Red Keep had witnessed countless judgments over the years, but few carried the weight of spectacle and consequence that accompanied the trial of Lucamore Strong. Every noble in King's Landing who could claim a right to attend packed themselves into that vast chamber. The common folk filled the corridors outside, pressing against guards for any scrap of information about the proceedings within. The Iron Throne loomed above it all, that twisted mass of swords forged by dragonfire, symbol of absolute royal authority. King Jaehaerys sat upon it, with the gravity of a man about to make history. Queen Alisanne sat beside him on her own seat, her presence a reminder that this judgment came not from rage but from considered deliberation. The small council occupied their places. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard stood with his 5 remaining brothers, their white cloaks a reproach to the man who had dishonored them all. Sir Riam Redwine's face was carved from stone, revealing nothing of the turmoil beneath. When the guards brought Lucamore into the throne room, gasps rippled through the assembled crowd. They had expected to see a broken man, perhaps, but the reality was starker. He wore simple prisoner's clothing. Where once he had worn pristine white, his hands were bound. He walked with the shuffle of someone whose world had ended and who knew worse was coming. They forced him to his knees before the Iron Throne. The same spot where he had knelt years ago to receive his white cloak now became the place where he would answer for destroying everything that cloak represented. The Grand Maester read the charges in a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. Each word fell like a hammer blow, breaking the sacred vows of the Kingsguard. Taking not 1 wife, but 3. Fathering not 1 child, but 16. Maintaining this deception for approximately 15 years. Misusing funds provided for his maintenance as a knight. Bringing dishonor upon the institution of the Kingsguard, betraying the trust of King Jaehaerys, who had personally selected him for the honor. The list continued, each charge more damning than the last. When the Grand Maester finished, silence filled the throne room. Everyone waited to see if Lucamore would attempt a defense. He did not. What defense existed? The facts were indisputable. 3 wives had been brought to King's Landing and questioned separately. Their testimonies matched in all essential details. 16 children had been counted and recorded. Neighbors and servants had witnessed years of visits. The financial record showed money flowing to 3 households. The case was absolute. Instead of defending himself, Lucamore spoke quietly about his families. He begged the king to show mercy not to him, but to the women and children who had done nothing wrong except trust him. This was his only moment of dignity in the entire proceeding, this attempt to shield others from the consequences of his actions. King Jaehaerys listened without expression. When Lucamore finished, the king leaned forward slightly, fixing him with a stare that had cowed greater men than a disgraced knight. The debate over punishment took longer than the trial itself. Precedent suggested execution. Desertion from the King's Guard had historically been treated as equivalent to desertion from any military order. A man who broke his oath to protect the king with his life had forfeited his own life in exchange. Several members of the small council argued for beheading as the only appropriate response. Others suggested the wall, that ancient barrier of ice at the edge of the world, where the Night's Watch stood eternal guard against whatever lurked beyond. Sending oath-breakers to the wall was common practice. They would take new vows, serve in a different capacity, and spend their remaining years in frozen exile. Queen Elizane spoke then, her voice calm but firm. She reminded the court of the 16 children who would lose their father if he was executed. Yes, Lucamore deserved punishment. Yes, his crimes were severe, but killing him served only vengeance, not justice. Those children, already bastards now, already facing lifelong shame because of their father's actions, did not deserve to also become orphans. Her words carried weight. Jahathres valued his wife's counsel above almost anyone else's. The good queen was called that for reasons, and her capacity for balancing mercy with justice was well known throughout the realm. But mercy alone would not suffice. The punishment had to be severe enough to deter any future Kingsguard knight from similar betrayal. It had to demonstrate that breaking these vows came with consequences so terrible that even considering it would inspire fear. The king's decision, when it came, satisfied both requirements in the most brutal way imaginable. Lucamore Strong would be gelded. The part of his body that had led him into sin would be removed, ensuring he could never father more children, never lie with another woman, never break his vows of celibacy again, because his body would make such breaking impossible. Then he would be sent to the wall. There he would take the black, swear new vows of celibacy that his mutilated body would force him to keep, and spend whatever years remained to him in service to the realm he had dishonored. The sentence was announced to absolute silence. Even those who had called for execution seemed stunned by the comprehensive cruelty of this punishment. It gave Lucamore his life, technically, but destroyed any possibility of that life containing meaning or joy. It was mercy and brutality combined into something almost worse than death. Lucamore's reaction was complex. Relief perhaps that he would not die. Horror certainly, at what was about to be done to him. Resignation that he deserved this or worse. His face cycled through emotions too quickly to track before settling into blank acceptance. The king spoke again, addressing the matter of Lucamore's families. The wives were guilty of no crime. They had been deceived, not complicit in deception. They would not be punished beyond the natural consequences of their situations. The children similarly bore no legal guilt. However, the marriages had never been legitimate. None of the wives could claim widowhood or any legal relationship to House Strong. The children were bastards in the eyes of law and gods, with no claim to names, lands, or inheritance. This was perhaps the cruelest part of the judgment. Lucamore's punishment would end eventually with his death at the wall. His families would carry the shame forever. His children would grow up marked, always known as the spawn of the lusty knight who betrayed his vows. Their children would carry that stain. Generations might pass before the name Lucamore Strong faded from memory as anything other than a cautionary tale. The trial ended with Lucamore being dragged from the throne room. Outside, the common folk surged forward, shouting questions at the guards, hungry for details. Within hours, the entire city knew the sentence, gelding and the wall. The punishment spread through the 7 kingdoms as fast as ravens could fly, carrying the message to every castle and keep that Kingsguard vows were not suggestions, and breaking them came with consequences that would haunt you until your last breath and beyond. In his cell beneath the Red Keep, Lucamore Strong had one night to contemplate what morning would bring. One last night with his body whole. One final evening before pain would teach him the price of pleasure stolen from forbidden places. He spent it remembering faces, 3 women who had loved him, 16 children who had called him father, the white cloak that had once made him feel invincible. All of it gone now, dissolved by the truth he should have known from the beginning. You cannot build a life on lies and expect it to stand forever. Eventually, gravity reasserts itself. Eventually, everything falls. They came for him at dawn. No ceremony marked the occasion. No formal gathering of witnesses. The sentence would be carried out with brutal efficiency in the bowels of the Red Keep, far from the throne room's grandeur, in chambers designed for exactly this type of grim necessity. Lucamore did not resist as guards hauled him from his cell. What purpose would resistance serve? The sentence had been pronounced by the king himself. There was no appeal, no last-minute reprieve, no possibility of escape. This was happening whether he fought or submitted. He chose submission, perhaps hoping it would make the ordeal less agonizing. The chamber they brought him to smelled of old blood and herbs, meant to mask that smell but never quite succeeding. A heavy wooden table dominated the space, scarred from years of similar procedures. Leather straps waited to secure struggling bodies. Sharp instruments lay arranged on a smaller table, their edges catching the torchlight with terrible promise. The Silent Sisters handled the actual procedure. These women, sworn to silence and dedicated to preparing the dead, also dealt with certain living tasks that required steady hands and absolute discretion. They had performed castrations before, usually on criminals whose offenses involved sexual violence. They approached this task with the same clinical detachment they brought to all their duties. Lucamore was given nothing for the pain. Some accounts suggest this was deliberate cruelty, punishment upon punishment. More likely it was simple practicality. Men undergoing such procedures needed to be conscious to avoid complications. Milk of the poppy or wine of sleep could cause them to choke or stop breathing. Better to suffer clearly than die struggling through drugged confusion. They strapped him down. The leather bit into his wrists and ankles as he instinctively pulled against restraints, even though he had promised himself he would stay still. The body has its own survival instincts that override conscious decision. The cut itself took only moments. The Silent Sisters were professionals, trained in the mechanics of flesh, quick and precise. That was their method. But those moments contained more agony than Lucamore had experienced in his entire life. Pain beyond description, beyond comprehension, a white-hot explosion that consumed all thought, all identity, reducing him to nothing but suffering. His screams echoed through the stone corridors. Guards standing watch outside the chamber heard them, and were grateful not to be inside. Servants passing through distant hallways paused, crossing themselves and whispering prayers. The sound of a man being unmade carried further than anyone expected. The cauterization came next, burning flesh to seal the wound and prevent fatal bleeding. If the cutting was agony, this was something worse. The smell of his own body burning mixed with the other odors of the chamber. He passed out briefly, his mind offering him the mercy of unconsciousness when the pain exceeded what a conscious mind could process. They revived him with cold water. The Silent Sisters needed to ensure he survived, needed to verify that the bleeding was controlled, that infection had not immediately set in. They worked with efficient care, bandaging the wound, administering herbs that would fight fever. Their job was to ensure he lived, not to comfort him in his suffering. When they finally released him from the table, Lucamore could barely stand. Guards had to support him. As they half-carried him back to his cell, every step sent fresh waves of pain through his body. The wound throbbed with his heartbeat, a constant reminder of what had been taken from him. In the days that followed, he learned new dimensions of suffering. The physical pain was intense, certainly, but manageable after the first terrible hours. Infection threatened constantly. Fever came and went. The wound wept and struggled to heal. But worse than any physical agony was the psychological devastation of understanding what this meant. He was no longer a complete man. The part of him that had driven so many decisions, that had led him to risk everything for moments of passion, was simply gone. He could not father more children, could not lie with a woman, could not even experience the basic human responses that mark adult masculinity. He had been rendered permanently incapable of the very acts that had destroyed his life. The nickname that had once seemed almost affectionate now became viciously ironic. Lucamore the Lusty, a man famous for excessive appetite, now possessing no capacity for satisfaction. Future generations would hear that name and laugh at the dark comedy of it. The punishment fit the crime so perfectly that it became legendary. During his recovery, Lucamore had time to think about his children. 16 faces haunted him. Would they understand someday why he had done what he did? Would they forgive him for loving them in a way that guaranteed their suffering? Or would they curse his memory, wish he had never been born, never fathered them into a world that would forever mark them as bastards and shame? He thought about his wives. 3 women who had organized their entire existence around him. What were they doing now? Had they found ways to survive? Did they hate him or pity him? Did any small part of them still remember the good moments, or had betrayal poisoned even those memories? The white cloak haunted him most of all, that beautiful symbol of honor and sacrifice. He had worn it with pride for years while simultaneously destroying everything it represented. The weight of it had seemed heavy when he first took his vows. Now, stripped of it forever, he finally understood it had never been a burden. It had been a gift he was too foolish to appreciate. 3 weeks after the gelding, when the worst of the physical healing had progressed enough that travel was possible, they came for him again. But this time, they brought black wool instead of surgical instruments. The Night's Watch was calling. The wall awaited a new life, or the closest thing to life that remained available to a man who had thrown away every better option. The journey north took weeks. Lucamore traveled with a group of criminals, rapers, thieves, and murderers being sent to take the black, men who had chosen the wall over execution, just as he had been given the wall after his own form of execution. They were chained together in a wagon that rattled over every rut in the King's Road, each jolt sending fresh pain through his healing wound. The other prisoners knew who he was. Everyone in the 7 kingdoms knew the story by now. Lucamore the Lusty, the Kingsguard knight with 3 wives and 16 children. Some of the men mocked him openly, making crude jokes about his condition. Others stayed quiet, perhaps recognizing that a man who had fallen so far required no additional humiliation. A few seemed almost sympathetic, understanding that they were all heading to the same frozen hell regardless of what crimes had sent them there. The landscape changed as they traveled. The warm southern lands gave way to cooler forests. Then those forests thinned and became sparse. The air grew colder each day. Lucamore watched this transformation with growing dread. He was leaving behind everything he had ever known, heading toward a wall of ice at the edge of the world where he would spend whatever years remained to him. His body continued healing during the journey, though healing is perhaps too generous a word. The wound closed, the risk of immediate infection passed, but what had been done to him was permanent, irreversible. He was changed fundamentally, and no amount of time would restore what the Silent Sisters had taken. Castle Black appeared on the horizon like a cluster of dark stones against darker earth. Behind it rose the wall itself, and Lucamore's first sight of it stole his breath. 700 feet of ice stretching east and west beyond vision. Ancient magic frozen into physical form, beautiful in its way, terrible in every other. This would be his home until death released him. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch received the new recruits with practiced indifference. He had seen thousands of men arrive at Castle Black over his years of service. Nobles and commoners, volunteers and criminals, all became the same once they took the Black. Brothers in a cause that cared nothing for who they had been before. But even this weathered commander paused when he read the name Lucamore Strong on the roster. The scandal had reached even this far north. He looked at the former Kingsguard knight with something between curiosity and contempt, then simply nodded and assigned him to a cell in one of the crumbling barracks. The ceremony where Lucamore took his new vows happened in the small sept at Castle Black. A handful of other recruits took the oath alongside him, criminals and desperate men seeking any escape from their former lives. They spoke the words together in that cold stone building, while wind howled outside. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children. I shall wear no crowns and win no glory. I shall live and die at my post. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch, for this night and all the nights to come. The vow of celibacy struck him like a physical blow. Take no wife, father no children. The exact same promise he had made as a Kingsguard knight. The vow he had broken so thoroughly that his punishment ensured he could never break it again. The irony was so bitter he almost laughed, but laughter died in his throat as the reality settled over him. He was bound by oath once more, but this time his body enforced what his will had failed to maintain. The punishment and the vow merged into a single chain he would wear until death. The black cloak they gave him felt nothing like the white one he had lost. Where white had been pristine and honored, black was stained and common. Where the Kingsguard cloak had made him special, the Night's Watch cloak made him identical to every other man who wore it. He had gone from the highest honor in the realm to joining the ranks of criminals and outcasts. Life at the wall demanded hard work and constant vigilance. Lucamore was assigned to training duty, initially, teaching new recruits basic sword work. His years as a Kingsguard knight meant he possessed skills valuable to the Night's Watch. Whatever else he had done, he could still fight, still teach others to defend themselves. The training yard at Castle Black became his domain. Young men arrived knowing nothing of combat, and Lucamore drilled them until they could at least hold a sword properly. Some showed promise, most did not. All of them needed to learn because wildlings beyond the wall did not care whether you were skilled, only whether you could be killed. His fellow brothers in the Night's Watch treated him with wary respect. They acknowledged his abilities while never letting him forget why he was there. The story of his disgrace became a favorite tale around the fires at night, told with dark humor and embellishment. Lucamore heard men laughing about the lusty knight who loved too well and paid for it in flesh. He endured these tellings in silence. What response could he offer? The stories were true. He had done everything they said, and more. Denying it accomplished nothing. Better to stay quiet and let them have their entertainment. The cold became his constant companion. Winter at the wall was brutal beyond anything he had experienced in the south, but ice formed on everything. Wind cut through even the thickest furs. Men froze to death in their sleep. If they were not careful, Lucamore learned to pile on layers, to never let the fire in his chamber die completely, to move constantly to keep blood flowing. Years passed in this routine, training recruits, standing watch on the wall, surviving the cold, enduring the stories. He grew older, his hair graying early from the harsh conditions. His body, already mutilated, bore new scars from minor injuries and frostbite. He became a fixture at Castle Black, one of those men who seemed like they had always been there and always would be. Sometimes he allowed himself to think about his children. They would be grown by now, or nearly so. Did any of them remember him? Did they know he still lived, frozen in exile at the edge of the world? Or had they written him off as dead, which in many ways he was? He thought about his wives less frequently. Those memories hurt too much. The way they had looked at him with love and trust, the lies he had told them so smoothly, the devastation on their faces when they learned the truth about each other. Better not to dwell on pain he could do nothing to remedy. The wall stood eternal, and Lucamore Strong stood upon it, a man who had wanted everything and ended with nothing but duty in the coldest place in the world. He trained men who would likely die fighting wildlings. He walked patrols along ice that never melted. He kept vows he could not break even if he wanted to. This was his life now. This was his penance. This was all that remained, until the cold or the wildlings or simple age took him and added his bones to all the others buried in the frozen ground beyond Castle Black. While Lucamore shivered at the wall, his families faced their own forms of exile in the south. The three women who had believed themselves married discovered that their entire lives had been built on sand. When the foundation dissolved, everything collapsed. The first wife, the one closest to King's Landing, suffered the most immediate consequences. Neighbors who had once been friendly turned hostile overnight. Her children were mocked in the streets, called bastards, and worse, the house Lucamore had rented for them was reclaimed when the payments stopped. She had no legal recourse, no husband to protect her, no family willing to claim association with the scandal. She tried to find work, but who employs the former mistress of a disgraced Kingsguard knight? Every door closed in her face, some kindly with apologetic expressions and genuine regret, others harshly with contempt for a woman foolish enough to be deceived so thoroughly. Within months she was destitute, forced to accept charity from scepters who at least did not judge her too harshly while providing barely enough to survive. Her children scattered. The oldest, barely 16, tried to find apprenticeships but carried the stain of their father's shame wherever they went. Some masters took them on, despite the scandal, recognizing that children should not suffer for their father's sins. Others refused, wanting nothing to do with Lucamore Strong's bastards. The younger children went to the faith, becoming novices in septs and monasteries, where at least they would have food and shelter, even if they would never have futures. The second wife in Duskendale faced slightly better circumstances simply because the scandal's epicenter was further away. Her neighbors knew the story certainly, but with less immediate intensity than those in King's Landing. She came from a merchant family, and they reluctantly took her back into their household, though the shame she brought with her was never forgotten or forgiven. Her children absorbed into her extended family as distant cousins, their true parentage acknowledged but not advertised. They would grow up on the margins of respectability, always aware they were there on sufferance, always one mistake away from being cast out. Some made decent lives, despite this burden. Others sank into bitterness and failure, unable to overcome the weight of a father they barely remembered, but whose legacy crushed them nonetheless. The third wife, furthest from King's Landing in the Riverlands, simply vanished from historical record. We know she existed because the trial records confirm 3 wives and 16 children total. But her name, her fate, the futures of her children remain unknown. Perhaps the distance allowed them some measure of anonymity. Perhaps the small town where they lived showed mercy and allowed them to remake their identities. Or perhaps their story ended in poverty and obscurity, too far from the centers of power for any chronicler to care about recording their struggles. The children bore the heaviest burden. 16 young people who had done nothing wrong except be born to the wrong father. The oldest were teenagers when the scandal broke, old enough to fully understand what it meant. The youngest were infants who would grow up, knowing their father only as a cautionary tale. None of them could claim the strong name legally. Bastards in the eyes of law and faith. They had no inheritance rights, no family connections they could leverage, no path to the lives they might have had if their father had kept his vows. Some tried to use the connection anyway, claiming descent from House Strong, but Harrenhal wanted nothing to do with them. The family issued formal declarations disavowing any relation to Lucamore's bastards. A few of the children found ways to overcome their circumstances. One son became a skilled blacksmith, his strength and dedication earning respect that gradually overshadowed his parentage. A daughter joined the Silent Sisters, finding peace in service and silence. Another son took ship across the narrow sea, seeking a new life in the free cities where no one knew or cared about Westerosi scandals. But others fared worse. Growing up marked as the spawn of the lusty night twisted some into bitter, angry adults who repeated their father's mistakes in different forms. At least 2 of the sons became criminals, one dying on the wall himself for theft and assault. One daughter fell into prostitution, the cruel irony of selling what her father had stolen not lost on those who knew her story. The question of whether any of them forgave their father has no clear answer. Some probably did, eventually understanding that he had loved them in his way, even if that love was selfish and destructive. Others carried hatred for him their entire lives, blaming him for every hardship they endured. Most likely fell somewhere between these extremes, feeling complicated mixtures of loss, anger, shame, and faint memories of a man who had made them feel special during his brief visits. House Strong's reputation suffered but survived. Harrenhal had weathered worse scandals over its cursed history. The family made it clear that Lucamore had brought shame only on himself, not on the house he had abandoned when he took the White Cloak. They emphasized that a Kingsguard knight renounced all family ties, therefore his crimes reflected on him alone. This was legally accurate, but emotionally dishonest. Everyone knew Lucamore was a strong, and whispers about weak moral character in that bloodline persisted for generations. Other houses used the scandal as ammunition in political disputes. When House Strong later rose to prominence during the Dance of the Dragons, their enemies would reference Lucamore as proof that Strongs could not be trusted to keep oaths or maintain honor. The 3 wives eventually died, their names forgotten by history. The 16 children lived, struggled, and died as well, some leaving descendants who carry Lucamore's blood without knowing it, others ending their lines entirely. By the time of the current events in Westeros, any direct descendants of Lucamore Strong have been absorbed into the general population, their connection to the Scandalous Knight lost to time. But while the people faded, the story remained. That was the cruelest legacy of all. Lucamore's wives and children suffered in obscurity, but his tale lived on, told and retold, a permanent stain on everyone associated with his name. The scandal of Lucamore Strong transformed the Kingsguard in ways that lasted for centuries. Lord Commander Ser Ryan Redwine, devastated that such corruption had flourished under his watch, implemented reforms designed to prevent any similar betrayal. The changes he made became standard practice that every future Lord Commander maintained. Background investigations became far more thorough. Before accepting a knight into the Kingsguard, the Lord Commander now sent inquiries to the man's home region. Did he have romantic entanglements? Any children, legitimate or otherwise? Women who might claim connection to him? Lords were questioned about the candidate's character, specifically regarding adherence to vows and oaths. Tournament victories and combat skill remained important, but moral integrity became equally weighted in the selection process. Financial oversight increased dramatically. Where previously Kingsguard knights managed their own stipends with minimal supervision, now the Lord Commander or his steward reviewed expenditures regularly. Unusual patterns triggered questions. A knight requesting large sums or spending significantly beyond his needs faced immediate scrutiny. The financial freedom that had allowed Lucamore to maintain 3 households disappeared, replaced by accounting measures that made such deception nearly impossible. The brotherhood itself became more tightly knit. Ryam encouraged his knights to spend more time together, building relationships that made isolation and secret lives harder to maintain. Regular meetings in the White Sword Tower, communal meals, shared training sessions, all of these created an environment where brothers knew each other well enough to notice behavioral changes. The Kingsguard had always been a brotherhood in name, but after Lucamore, it became one in practice. The story itself became the most powerful deterrent. Every new recruit heard the tale during their first weeks of service. The Lord Commander would recount Lucamore's fall in explicit detail, describing the 3 wives, 16 children, the discovery, the trial, and most importantly, the punishment. Gelding and the wall. The words were spoken with weight, ensuring every knight understood that breaking the vow of celibacy came with consequences so severe that no moment of pleasure could possibly be worth the price. The white cloak worn by every Kingsguard knight became heavier with the added weight of Lucamore's failure. Where once it represented only honor and sacrifice, now it also carried warning. This beautiful symbol of service could be lost in an instant if vows were broken. The contrast between Lucamore kneeling to receive his white cloak and Lucamore kneeling in chains to receive judgment became a meditation on how quickly glory transforms into shame. King Jaehaerys himself used the scandal as a teaching moment about the importance of institutions over individuals. In small council meetings, he would reference Lucamore when discussing the need for accountability and consequences. A king who allowed his most elite warriors to mock their vows was a king who invited chaos into his realm. Justice had to be consistent and severe, or it became meaningless. The scandal reached beyond the Kingsguard into broader discussions about the nature of vows and whether requiring lifelong celibacy was realistic or fair. Some septons argued that men were not meant to live without wives and families, that asking such sacrifice inevitably led to violations like Lucamore's. Others countered that plenty of knights kept their vows faithfully, that Lucamore's failure was personal weakness, not institutional flaw. These debates never resulted in changing the vows. The Kingsguard continued requiring celibacy because the sacrifice itself was the point. Knights who could give up everything proved their absolute dedication to the king they served. Allowing marriage would dilute that dedication, creating divided loyalties. The price of Lucamore's crime actually strengthened the institution by demonstrating what happened when that standard was abandoned. Songs about Lucamore spread throughout the 7 kingdoms, some bawdy tavern ballads that exaggerated the details for comedic effect, others more somber warnings about the price of broken oaths. Minstrels would sing of the knight with 3 wives at feasts and festivals, always getting laughs or knowing nods. The story had everything audiences loved: scandal, hypocrisy, dramatic justice, and a punishment so fitting it seemed almost poetic. Future generations of Kingsguard knights lived in Lucamore's shadow. Whenever a knight showed even minor interest in a woman, his brothers would joke about him becoming the next Lucamore. The comparison was never meant kindly. It served as social pressure to maintain proper distance from temptation, using shame as a preventive measure. The comparison to Jaime Lannister would not come for over 2 centuries, but when it did, the 2 knights represented opposite types of Kingsguard betrayal. Lucamore broke vows of celibacy and fathered children. Jaime broke his vow to protect the king and became a kingslayer. Both earned permanent infamy. Both became cautionary tales. But where Jaime's betrayal was a single dramatic act with political justification, Lucamore's was sustained personal failure, driven purely by selfish desire. Meisters recording the histories of Jaehaerys' reign always included Lucamore's story in their chronicles. It was too significant to omit, too perfectly illustrative of themes about honor, duty, and consequences. Young lords learning history would read about the 3 wives and 16 children, about the gelding and the wall, and absorb lessons about keeping one's word and accepting that some positions require sacrifices not everyone can make. The white cloak itself became more carefully guarded after Lucamore. When a Kingsguard knight died, his cloak was ceremonially burned or preserved in the White Sword Tower as a relic. Never again would it be allowed to become soiled through years of deception. The physical object took on even greater symbolic importance, a reminder that what it represented was sacred and its desecration came with terrible costs. Centuries later, when the Kingsguard had weathered other scandals and failures, Lucamore the Lusty remained the standard by which sexual misconduct was measured. His name became synonymous with that particular form of betrayal. To be called another Lucamore was among the worst insults one Kingsguard knight could level at another. The legacy he left was not the one he intended. He had wanted to be remembered as a great knight, a skilled warrior, perhaps even a loving father. Instead, he became a punchline and a warning, his name forever tied to shame, mutilation, and exile in frozen darkness. What remains when we strip away the scandal and the songs, when we move past the shock of 3 wives and 16 children, is a question far more uncomfortable than the story itself. Was Lucamore strong, a monster, or was he simply human in ways the institution he served could not accommodate? The vows he swore were absolute. Take no wife, father no children, serve until death. Clear words spoken before gods and king, impossible to misunderstand. He knew exactly what he promised, and he broke those promises deliberately, repeatedly for nearly 2 decades. There is no ambiguity in that betrayal. Yet we must also acknowledge what those vows demanded. Complete celibacy for life, imposed on young men in their physical prime. Men trained for combat and courage, but not necessarily for the kind of spiritual discipline that celibacy requires. The Kingsguard expected its members to simply stop being human in certain fundamental ways. For most of history, this worked because the honor of service and the glory of the white cloak outweighed the sacrifice. But Lucamore was not most knights. He possessed a hunger for connection, for love, for family that no amount of honor could satisfy. His tragedy was not that he was uniquely evil, but that he was uniquely unsuited for the life he chose. A man who craved intimacy, swearing an oath that forbade it completely, is a disaster waiting to unfold. This does not excuse his actions. His wives deserved honesty. His children deserved a father who could claim them openly. His king deserved a knight who kept his word. The lies he told destroyed innocent lives, and that destruction was his fault alone. Understanding why someone commits terrible acts is not the same as forgiving those acts. The punishment he received reflected medieval justice at its most uncompromising. Gelding was brutal, permanent, designed to ensure the crime could never be repeated while allowing the criminal to live and suffer. Modern sensibilities recoil from such mutilation, but in the context of Westerosi culture, the sentence made perfect sense. He used his body to break sacred vows, so his body was altered to make further violations impossible. Sending him to the wall showed a kind of mercy within the brutality. He lived, which meant his children did not lose their father to execution. He had opportunity for redemption through service in the Night's Watch. The frozen exile was harsh, certainly, but it gave him purpose when he could easily have been discarded entirely. His children paid the highest price for crimes they never committed. 16 young lives, shadowed by shame, they did nothing to earn. Some overcame it through determination and character. Others were crushed by weight they were too young to carry. This is perhaps the truest tragedy of the entire story, that innocence suffered while guilt merely endured. The women he deceived also deserve consideration. 3 separate individuals who built their entire existences around a man who was performing 3 different versions of himself. When the truth emerged, It did not just end their relationships, it invalidated years of their lives, turned cherished memories into lies, and left them with nothing but children to feed and shame to bear. And yet, for all the pain and consequences, human nature has not changed. Knights still struggle with vows. Men and women still choose desire over duty. Institutions still demand sacrifices that some cannot make. Lucamore's story resonates across centuries because it touches something eternal about the conflict between what we want and what we promise, between who we are and who we claim to be. The wall still stands, that ancient barrier of ice and magic, holding back whatever darkness waits beyond. Lucamore's bones rest somewhere in the frozen ground near Castle Black, unmarked and forgotten, except in the stories that outlived him. The White Cloaks still guard the kings of Westeros, though the Targaryens who ruled when Lucamore served have long since fallen. The vows remain unchanged, as absolute now as they were then. What his story teaches depends on who tells it. To some, he is a villain who betrayed everything sacred. To others, a man trapped by vows he should never have taken. To his descendants who may not even know they carry his blood, he is simply a name in history, if that. The truth likely exists somewhere between these interpretations. Lucamore Strong was a skilled warrior who became a terrible husband, an honored knight who became a systematic liar, a loving father who guaranteed his children's suffering. A man capable of great dedication, who channeled that dedication toward deception instead of duty. He wanted everything and lost it all. The White Cloak and the family, the honor and the love, the glory and the intimacy. He believed he could have both, by hiding one from the other. The fundamental mathematics of his situation made that impossible. Eventually, secrets surface. Eventually, lies collapse. Eventually, the price comes due. In the end, what remains is a cautionary tale that survives long after the man himself has faded into frozen earth. A reminder that vows matter, that choices have consequences, that institutions built on trust crumble when that trust is betrayed. But also a reminder that behind every scandal are human beings, flawed and complicated, trying to navigate impossible situations with imperfect wisdom. The stars turn above Westeros tonight, as they have for thousands of years. The wall catches their light and throws it back as pale reflection. The throne room where Lucamore knelt twice, once in glory and once in shame, sits empty in the darkness. The houses where 3 women raised 16 children have long since crumbled or been occupied by others with different stories, different sorrows. All of it passes. The people, the buildings, the kingdoms themselves eventually fade. But the stories endure, carried forward by those who find meaning in the failures and triumphs of those who came before. If you have enjoyed this journey into one of Westeros's most scandalous chapters, I invite you to subscribe for more deep explorations of the histories, mysteries, and hidden tales of the 7 kingdoms. There are countless stories waiting to be told, legends waiting to be examined, and truths waiting to be uncovered in the vast tapestry of this world. Let the tale of Lucamore the Lusty fade now into the peaceful darkness where all stories eventually rest. Let sleep come gently, carrying with it perhaps some wisdom about the weight of promises, the cost of deception, and the eternal struggle between desire and duty that defines so much of human existence. Rest well, and may your own vows, whatever they may be, sit lighter on your shoulders than the White Cloak sat on his.